Okay. This talk is divided into two pieces. One is what I would call the summary statement, my summary statement about the proclamation. The original draft was written in 1972. It lay for all this time, and in the last number of years, and especially in the last year or so, I revised the whole thing, realizing that I made a big mistake in entering the document. And there was an article in the Jerusalem Post last week about how to teach the proclamation as in the high schools. And so I have something to say about that, and it really functions as a kind of a summary of what this document is all about, what it's not and what it is. And the second thing is, I want to start by quoting a number of paragraphs from somebody who was in the 50s, who was in Jerusalem, lived in Jerusalem, and wrote a diary of May and June of 1948. And just for us it's history. For us it's history, and we dig into the ideas in this, but for people who lived right there on the spot, it's a different impression. It's the real thing. I mean, you wouldn't believe it, but it's the real thing. So I just want to start off by quoting a number of things from this guy who gave us this diary, call it. Okay. So some 3 weeks ago, one afternoon, I was at prayer meeting in a synagogue in the Bohemian Quarter of the city. Shells began to fall, about 16 of them, very loud and near bangs. It's not too good in terms of English. In about as many minutes. That is how the shelling began. And there was some weak protest from the Jews, but not nearly strong enough, in my opinion. Since Friday, the day that the High Commissioner left Jerusalem, the shelling has continued. At first, intermittently, but hundreds have been fired. From what my ears hear, there have been some casualties. One fell near a water line and wounded some of the people that were on the roof. I've seen the pit in the street, not very far from our house. Naturally, it has caused some nervousness, and far fewer persons have come into the bank, as the streets are positively unpleasant to walk through just now. This guy worked in Barclays Bank, which is the British bank, and that's the bank that's down when you go down when you make the turn to go to the hotel, to get into there. There's a building that has a round facade. It's all full of bullet pocket holes there. That's where this guy worked. And I guess they had, for employees, they had that building they use as a shelter, and then there are other people that live there. Okay, so he says, this lack of security is the most distressing feature of the latest declaration of war on the newly born Jewish state, already mentioned. We know of very little of what has happened. He lived in Rechavia. My house has had no electricity for several days, though there are some that have had current for a few hours in the day. The past nights have been spent in darkness, as we have to conserve the few candles we still have left. Yesterday we were given a ration of 2.5 tins of water, the first distribution since the mainline press reported that the main jumping station was handled by the British Army, handed over to the Iraqis, but no plausible reason for this or many other mysteries that confront us has been provided. As a mature person in the 50s, this guy expressed his feelings of what he and many others felt at the time. What was this impact? The people apparently. The people lived in Jerusalem were allowed to get to their homes, but it was quite dangerous, and the streets were with people, but but still not the best. And as you see right off the bat, the main problem is food and water for these people. And not knowing and not having access to what's going on was a very trying situation. Okay, so he talks here about the Pesach, and that was May 17th, 1948. A celebration for this, pardon the English here, some of the things are not corrected. Anyway, the celebration for the setting up of a new state here in Jerusalem, we have seen little. Since the population was under the throes of an aggravating war for its existence, at the time of this writing, we have only little food given us in daily rations, 250 grams. Not much. 250 grams mixed bread, some little butter or margarine for children. Water is given to households, but fuel has been stopped for some months. Electricity has been cut off, and there is no news except from reduced papers. I guess the papers printed, but there were very short, editions. 4 pages, 8 pages, 6 pages. Well, here it is. This morning, the Palestine Post was in favor of a stencil. Of a stencil of 4 pages. Double summertime was introduced, as we had little or no light. On Friday, the 14th of May, the Jews managed to overrun the important police grounds and the big general post office downtown, building as far as the old bank. Saturday started with the continual shootings covering the whole town. I was asked to be at the meeting place at 9 a.m. and when instructed to go to remove the wires protecting not eligible, and obtain the proper rabbinic authority from the fortification of the city. At 5 p.m., after a short interval for lunch, liver sausage spread on bread, I helped to keep up mincha at a deserted Yeshua synagogue. The shelling continued, and fighting was fairly severe, so that we no longer hope for convoys of our supplies to come, but we all naturally prefer that the boys should get their arms and ammunition to defend our homes from destruction by the Arab hordes. Sunday the 16th, I spent it at a roadblock. This is a guy in the 50s, so because you'll see later, he got so much, the digging and trench and different things, that he asked if he could ease up a little bit and do some other work that wasn't so taxing. So it's not a young whippersnapper kid, he's an older man, and of course I met him and knew him, and he was quite a guy. But okay, so this was the thing. The fighting continues, and the latest moves appear to be centered around the old city, which is in a tight corner, yet putting up a magnificent fight against greatly superior numbers. Strange that the latest rumor is that they are holding out 1,500 against some 30,000. I don't know how the figures run, but it was certain that this is true, and at that kind of a situation, the numbers expand and contract accordingly. So I don't know if this is fact, but this was what they heard. The schools have closed, and it's an added responsibility for us to see that the children do not get into the streets. One has very little time to oneself, as the Mishmar Ha'am is calling for 48 hours weekly from each member engaged in business. Others are taken for full-time service. A strong discussion is taking place over the yeshiva men, as the rabbis do not want to release them from their studies in view of the difficulty in getting them to resume this unpaid life and when hostilities cease. Well, we're 65 years later.
What's changed?
We're 65 years later. There it is.
No change.
Great confusion is also being caused, as here in Jerusalem, one does not know whether or not we will be victorious on somewhere here under a Jewish state, and will have to abide by their financial decisions, or if the UN will ever be in a position to carry on an effectively a neutral or joint administration. For myself, I would not like to consider ever having to work side by side again with the persons who have turned on us in such savage fashion and for so little reason. What have I of my own done to them to deserve their firing last evening 7 or 8 deadly shells at me and my family, who have never declared war on them. And why do they wish to deprive me of my right to pray at my only holy place left to me in the world? In the world, which has practically little significance for themselves. This is now May 20th, the next day. Having returned to the bank, I put it next on this one. This shelling is now coming from the police training school on Mount Scopus, which for a while was occupied by IZL. What's that? What's the Z? I don't know. Well, anyway, but who were forced to return near our bases for the lack of significant support from our hard-pressed Haganah forces. The Arab Legion are now strongly entrenched in it and can fire this way for as long and as often as their British officers allows them. As the story, you could fill in for the details. It's firsthand what's going on. As a matter of fact, this guy lived in Rehavia, and he used to, for Sukkot, they used to pay the Arabs to bring schach into Rehavia.
To bring what?
Schach, for the roof of the sukkah. But the British were, of course, blocking everything, and they'd have to do it under the QT to give the Arab guy to bring in schach for Sukkot. Anyway, the Arab Legion are now strongly entrenched in it and can fire this way for as long and as often as their British officers allow them. We turn to the newspapers to read whether the UN can interfere in this little byplay, and do not see much immediate relief from there. The more probable course will be that our own Palmach may try to make a frontal attack on the camp and on the nest of legionnaires left on Mount Zion, which is also far too near us, and from where they send over every now and then salvos of mortars. The latter explode on contact, but do not seem to penetrate the walls of most Jewish houses made of stone. I was therefore not so agreeably surprised this morning to see the effects of one of the heavier shells in the street near to us, which had smashed into a house, funnily enough, that had been only scarred by an early mortar hit. Yet, Tel Aviv has to face up to air raids by Egyptian forces, which hit and run at the crowded bus station, killing 41 and wounding 60 men, women, and children. One plane was shot down. It was a British Spitfire with the RAP markings overpainted on the yellow colors. He actually saw this plane. That, remember, when the war was that the British had that circle. When we were kids, me anyway, we used to draw the planes that had that British the Spitfire. The U.S. had the Spitfire, and the British had this, I forget what they call it. And here he says, you could see the overpainted with yellow colors. I mention this in case this item is also not reported in your local press. The point of this part of this diary was to, as he's free running, to bring in facts that if you weren't there, you wouldn't see. And the press, as always, skews the articles. I once gave, just with Derech Hagav, I once gave a press conference in Tel Aviv. Well, I said all that? I said that? I mean, they're trained, newspaper people are trained to ask questions that take you off guard, and try to catch a moment. I said, if I won the Nobel Prize, I wouldn't give an interview to anybody. It's impossible. And then they messed up the pictures. They put my picture under somebody else's name and so on. And so I said, my God, this is the news media. It's unbelievable. Okay, so it's a part of his, as a mature guy here, part of his point here was to try to get across, or not to eliminate things that may not get into the news. Okay, so I mentioned this in case it's not. You'll remember that all this time we are cut off from the outside world. This is the 5th week that any food convoy has not been able to come to us. The walls have stenciled notices of some minor rations of food to be had, but even the bread ration has not been distributed, as most bakers and shops are closed, either through lack of men or power or materials. My standby of matzahs is helping us, but we are now reduced to the last one, and one has to go slow. as the uncouth heroes are not so easily displaced. By the way, they were shelling the Hadassah Hospital for hours last night. This is May 20th, 1948. This should prove of interest to our many Ezra supporters here and there. Okay, a few more things to give the flavor. Yesterday afternoon, the position became much more serious, and I'm sorry to say that some people even began to feel somewhat pessimistic. Apart from the shelling that continues from time to time, with intervals in between to give the population the feeling that it has stopped, and so that they venture out of improvised shelters into the street again, one huge shell fell near a busy corner and wounded a woman and child. It has been also caused the movement of those who have somewhere else to stay within what may seem to be a safer part of the town, though the many that have fallen seem to be all over and no one can predict what is safe. He says again, it wasn't a ghost town in the sense of nobody on the streets, but Ben Yehuda and other streets were very minimally populated. For 10 days, here's an entry from 27th of May, 1948. For a few days, we were expecting any time that there would be a ceasefire, as the Jewish government of Israel had agreed to the UN. UN's appeal issued 2 days ago, but the Arabs first postponed their reply and finally have refused. This has not given rise to too much regret, as it is felt that any ceasefire would not in itself solve our problem, and that a complete victory may prove in the long run more effective. The deadly shelling of the town continues, although they have now adopted different tactics. They wait for a suitable time and then fire several rounds of rockets to make the destruction more effective, causing loss of life to the civilian population. That's what gets as the result. They have some incendiary bombs too, and some fires have been started with smoke pouring into the sky. But life has to go on. Our duties consist now of distributing water in the streets from lorries having some tanks linked up together, which are filled at the main water station. Householders wait till the cart comes near to a house, then line up with assortments of pails, buckets, tanks, and ever baby baths into which we have to estimate or measure a half tin allowed each person in the household, according to tickets that an appointed person in each house distributes in advance, in charge of that covers the cost of the cartage. In the United States, I was a kid for World War II, but however, there were shortages of everything, of food and so on. And you had tickets, coupons that you had to give to the grocer or whatever to eat.
That's right.
That was part of the pattern. Yeah. Okay, and he says here our food ration comes in bits and in small quantities, as now we're entering the 7th week since any food has been brought to the town. Again, you have to picture what that is, when there's no trucks, no things coming in, and people just can't do anything and get the victim of this situation. So, okay, meanwhile, the shelling continues for the 18th day. The deaths are not reported, though we do now and then get some first-hand report. On Saturday, a shell entered a synagogue and killed 3, wounding 11. Also, one comes across the holes in the pavements and the pools of blood, very often that of children, I'm afraid to state. The Arab Legion of King Abdullah is the actual army attacking us, but its equipment and officers are British, and there is no doubt in my mind that this is a crime that many years will remain a stain on their character in my eyes. And how do they explain the use of phosphorescent bombs that cause such harm? My sleep on Thursday night was twice disturbed. They called on me to come to help remove wounded from the old city, but I felt I was not fit for condition for this. However, at 3:30, some others knocked for the same purpose, and I claimed I was not well. So the next day I was sent to be examined, and as the voluntary medical was unable to see me, I got a private doctor to give me at least 5 days off. On Shabbos there was a renewed sorting out of able-bodied persons, as they now required men up to 55 for full-time work. Instead of doing physical work, digging and lifting, I felt justified to try and have some more technical or theoretical activities, and I went yesterday to see the section at the agency building, but here I was filtered off to another body where I had already had some contact, and though my name is on the listings, apparently others are more pushful, for nothing seems to come of it. The old city, you can't read it, from 12 to 14 days, they had poured shell fire into the quarter, and house after house was blown up. Then they gathered in the big chur of a synagogue, you know, near the Ramban with the big arch. And when people came to pray on Friday, they blew this up for just for his own gratification, the king. So two old rabbis walked over to the Arabs, taking a white flag, and although one was wounded, they came to terms. The men, actually boys from 15 up to 55, were taken prisoners, and the very old set free. I found 3 or 4 who knew his father sitting at a rabbi's on Shabbos afternoon. They had come with only their rather dilapidated Shabbos clothes with them. All their worldly possessions had been lost to them forever, and the world should make up their loss when it gets to know the beastly life they had been forced to live for 6 months. As the mandate was so spitefully supposed to end, illegible. We feel princely with our meager rations and with his wife's ability to make something tasty out of next to nothing. His children, he had 2 sons. Incidentally, B'derech Hagav, one of his sons died of thirst in the army, got lost in the desert. It's hard to believe in our day, but his jeep got lost and he couldn't survive. We feel princely with our meager rad. The boys have now started to take lessons at a nearby house a few days. They are now standing around me as I type, waiting to hear if this machine rings the bell when the line is finished. Remember the old typewriters? You came to the end and your thing. Okay, it doesn't, but as long as they hope for it, I'll let them wait. So we waited for peace. This morning there is more movement in the town, as there was a feeling that there would be a truce at midnight on June 1st. This is the 5th of June. And the Jewish forces stopped all fighting then, though the Arabs continued to shoot, greatly to our surprise. The reason became clear last night when I took advantage of the electric current which came on our line to listen in on the debate at the Security Council taking place on June 2nd at Lake Success, New York. It was significant that the chairman of the month happened to have been chosen from the ranks of our worst enemies, namely the representative for Syria, and no wonder that he was able to justify the delay in accepting the call for a ceasefire. However, while there has been a slowing down of the immediate danger in Jerusalem, there has been no easing of the food supply. It may appear superfluous to repeat it so often, but the question at the moment is important, and I mention it again. In order to let the repeated reference to food shortages act as a remaining memory long after the usual supplies can again be bad. For this week, they have cut down the ration to a loaf of bread for 5 of us, his family. And that is 1/3 of what we really require. There being so very little else. With the current coming about twice a week, we have caught up with the washing and the children. My shirts are ironed away, and with a water ration of half a tin per head, we have no water problem. Thank God. It's enough of the other kind to be the main subject of our own, everyone else's conversation. 8 weeks is a long time to keep a town without a grain of food from entering, and all the empty talk of keeping the holy city free from the curse of war is empty and probably hypocritical, fit for the type of churchmen you expect to find in decaying houses of worship, not to forget all the goodwill missions and their empty promises. Do you know that there are thousands of very young children, as well as many very old and helpless people, that are simply verging on starvation? Where are the humanitarian institutions of the world, and where is the Red Cross, or UNRWA, or its other high-sounding relief organizations. A very, very, in the history, a very big disappointment in terms of the institutions that are dedicated to help were meager, to say the least. Most of the refugees from the old city are being kept in Kadamon as an Arab suburb that was overrun recently by the Haganah forces, and I believe that they are being looked after, though not in too good a way. Others have found their way to shuls and fit in somehow in the inner rooms or corridors, but without very much hope for to look forward to. The call up for manpower continues, and I am glad that they just give me the simpler jobs, like the one I had yesterday, which was to go around with the water and fill up the collection of tins and tubs that are offered to us by the lines of people in the district. To end up on a more cheerful note, he and his wife went to, I don't know what it said, the hospital this morning for a Brit Milah of a friend's third son, and although even from a wealthy family, it was hard to provide a little more than a mouthful to the guests, as there was a glass of wine and the usual cheer. For a moment, he saw one of the neighbors, and so on and so on, a glass of wine and the usual cheer. She told him that the office is continuing to function, what was the British bank, and that they are doing all they can to provide as much relief to the pregnant woman. And when I told her that the idea is to give as great help as possible, despite the fact that there is no communication with the outside world, and that their own chairman in Tel Aviv, miles apart, and no connections. But Baruch Hashem, youngsters continue to be born and blessed. Okay, just to finish up, this is June 6th. June 8th, during the past night or two, the shelling has been particularly heavy. Salvos of 20 to 25 heavy explosions in quick succession, falling debris, and the clang of raw as it mashes past one and more wounded in the clinics. These themselves have been the target of the wild enemy. Our main institutions in town is the Kupat Golim building, and it has been flying the Red Cross in two large white flags, not the Hebrew Magen David Adom. Yet it has been heavily shelled, notwithstanding that it was the International Red Cross. That the International Red Cross was supposed to be doing most. But anyway, not the Hebrew. Yet it was heavily shelled, and I understand that it may have to be evacuated, although it is in the center of the town. Coming along the streets this morning, I found many of the results of the night attack in shell holes of the main streets, and of course the piles of broken glass from the smashed shop windows. Yet the streets have people in them, and most, if not all, the main shops are open behind closed doors for some imaginary extra safety. The rations have to be distributed, and in some districts bread was given yesterday at the current 125 grams per person. But in Rehavia, our own district, we did not receive any bread up to 8 p.m. last night. On the other hand, his wife was given her May ration of sugar of 2 kilos per household, as against the normal proportion of 4 kilos that we have been receiving up to the present. The question that is being asked today, this is June 8th, the question that's being asked today is why the shelling is so one-sided. Could not there be spared a few for the other side? Or is it the policy of the Israel state to let the damage be done against us only? The Palestine Post appeared something about Spain. Yesterday we had only a short bulletin of the latest moves by the UN mediator, Count Bernadotte, supposed to be arranging a truce, but no one knows how much he is capable of doing. Although I imagine that it is no easy task with so many Arab nations taking part in the discussion, and so many sinister, private, and very confidential other interests working behind the scenes and schemes. One significant item is the news published today that the Vatican has officially denied that it ever issued a formal protest at the shelling of the Hadassah Hospital and the Hebrew University, which has been smashed by Arab Legion artillery. Yet, as far as I can see, I cannot understand why they should take such pains to deny what, something or other, have been a very proper and fitting thing for them to raise their voice in protest. If history will clear this sort of will clear up this sort of news items, so much the better. The next question is the road to Jerusalem, which in the opinion of many should be forced now, even before the so-called truce begins. We do not hear of small convoys of jeeps that make their way across the mountains to bring up small arms ammunition. But so far, for 8 weeks, no lorries have come, and this is the most essential to keep up our resistance. Even if we did not enjoy anything that was brought, it would make us feel at least justified in using up to our very last reserves of foodstuffs for those who at least have still something in the bottom shelf. My own problem is for lighting and heating, and his wife buy DDT, which apparently was a big problem to spray, and I guess from the food and the dirt and the lichluch was a big thing, and it was rationed and very difficult to get. So he said this was a big thing. My own problem is for lighting and so on. I mean, this DDT, without fainting, I'm glad that we at least found another small supply in a local shop. I skipped a couple other places where he talks about some of the prices. As in every situation of that kind, there were prices that were prohibitive to do anything, whether it was coffee, whatever the things were. Okay, just to finish up. Indeed, these things never finish. And for us, it's the past, and I think that that's enough. You know, I have a few more other things here, and this is a diary for 2 months in May and June of 1948, to give a kind of a picture to what, for you and I, is history, you know, and document and an analysis of everything. But there's a real world out there, and one of the criticisms of academia bichlal has been too passive in relation to the world, the real world, the world of people and so on, the food and shelter and all the rest, and not just ideation. Okay, but tonight we are going to deal with some ideation, and I'm putting it in terms of what is this proclamation all about? Now I'm going to just read one more thing. The Jerusalem Post had an article last week in the magazine section about teaching the proclamation. There was an article about how to teach it. They have a program in Bar Ilan, and I had something to say about that, because the way I approached the document in 1972, when I first wrote the draft, that's a long time ago, when I first wrote the draft of this document, I fell into the trap of trying to explain it. And, well, the state will be based on natural right and historic right. Well, this is a public document. There were 50 people who signed it, whatever, but these are philosophical terms. Natural right. There's a history of natural right, when it went out, when it was not viable anymore. Rousseau made it such that it's not viable. And then there was something called historic right. We have to talk about what that is. And this was the orientation. Then the other part of the document is the state will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. I was so obtuse in 1972 that I read it understood. I said, it says, as understood by the prophets of Israel. I looked at the document. It doesn't say understood. It says envision, which, without using the word prophecy, meant the envisionment of the prophets. And that changes your whole sense. I was so tuned in to try to explain what the document was all about that I fell into the trap of saying they're giving you their understanding. It was the envision. And it had that messianic tone. And then the state will be based on freedom, justice, and peace understood by the prophets of Israel. Interestingly enough, equality, which is the fourth socio-political value, in the document is not included in the phrase of freedom, justice, and peace understood by the prophets. Now, there have been some work in the research. The guy Berman, there was some research on equality in the orientation of the biblical world, and later, even in the King period and so on. So it's not a black and white situation. But in the document, they opted, and this, I'm not dealing with what the debates and the religion part of it and so on, but they opted not to include equality in the phrase that went with the prophets, because to me the idea of the chosen people was still in 1948 a viable thing for most of the people who were there and who signed the document. So it, in effect, when we look at it in retrospect, we see that there was a chizuk, there was a strengthening of this motif. So there was the messianic motif, and there was this motif, and now we come to what is the problem, shall we say, with the document. So I said, here's my letter, that maybe it'll be in the paper on Sunday, Sunday. I'm still in the States. Sunday. Anyway, Friday, tomorrow's paper. Medina Yisrael is living, but its proclamation of independence is conceptually dead. Both natural right and historic right, upon which the state is declared to be based, are not viable concepts. They have been dissolved in the U.S. Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And here's the Declaration. I have a big copy, you know. And here's the Declaration, and this Declaration is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this was put up by the UN in 1948, as a matter of fact, shortly after this thing that we're talking about, so May and June. And this has become the standard international picture on socio-political values. And so what happened was that natural right was no longer viable since 1840, when Rousseau critiqued it, and historic right, well, what is that? That's our problem for tonight. What is that? What do you mean historic right? Well, the distinction that was operative in this area was the distinction between things by nature and things by convention. That goes through Plato and Aristotle and the philosophers. That was the beginning point of looking intellectually at polity, at the societal structure. And so the basic orientation was by nature, that somehow by studying nature, it would reveal its purposes. It had a teleological dimension, philosophical. And that was intrinsic to the Greek understanding. And then there was, by analogy or by differentiation, there was things by convention, by agreement. Well, here we have what's left. What's left is agreement, is universal. Universal rights, human rights. And historic right, then, as I developed it, turned out to be biblical right. In other words, that the Jews had a right to go back to their land because God promised them, or whatever the thing is, and it's some kind of a theological picture or image or whatever. And historic right was just this, but it depends who's writing the history. I'm going to talk a little bit about halachic right. Well, it depends who's writing the halacha. I mean, it's a great system. It's a legal system that deals with the status, the boundaries, the measurement, the whole picture of the polity of Yisrael. But it's in a legal system that's not universal. I mean, it's the Jews. And today we have problems accepting, but that's not the point for the moment. So the problem was, I discovered at that time in 72 that historic right meant biblical right. And so that was the picture. Well, even at that time, conceptually, how can you make such a mistake? It means right by convention. There was only natural right or historic right. So it's right by convention. So if you agree with the Bible, then that's called historic right. And so, as I finished this article, so I said, historic right, the natural right and historic right are not viable concepts today. They have been dissolved in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The state of Israel is based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. However, today, prophecy is not accepted by many, many, many people. Moreover, the messianic character of the document is also not viable for the vast majority of Jews living both in and outside of Israel. Further, equality, the fourth basic socio-political value, by not being included in the envisioning of the prophets, implicitly strengthens the chosen people motif that is also in question by many today. Fortunately, the document talks much about historic association between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. This is important, notwithstanding that the association being a fact does not imply the value that is historic right. In other words, right is a value term, like good and so forth. It's a value-laden term. And the basic rule that everybody's taught in college and high school, that you can't get value from fact. You have the fact, but you can't get a value unless you now say, okay, we're going to make agreement that grows out of the factual situation. We're going to make that agreement into something by convention, by agreement, and therefore we can talk about rights. But it's a juridical, moral concept. So in the document, it talks about historic right, but it also talks about association between the Jews and their land. Okay, and I, by coming up with a conclusion, first half of which is that it's a shanda, it's a shame. We have a document for the state. The state is living and thriving and going day to day. But the proclamation document is not viable. There's no natural right, and there's no biblical right in the sense that people agree. It depends who we're talking about. And as you know, in the theological framework, in the Quran, I should have marked the place. I probably read it on the Shabbat and didn't mark the place. But in the Quran, it says explicitly that because the Jews did not keep the Torah system, God took it away from them and gave it to us, Muhammad is talking, even though we were never here before. Now, I went for a walk and we went to Dal Mincha because I never thought, I thought that the right and the discussion of the land issue came from Yishmael, that it came from the Bible and Avram's son, and he, there was a problem with what he inherited, what he did, and so it wasn't clean, and so that was the basis. Well, I read that in the Furash, in the text, and I read, that's a theological argument. And it was used in Christianity for the same way about the ceremonial law, which we talked about last time. But the point is, this was the orientation. Okay, so I was faced with a very difficult problem, and just by the way, in '72 when I wrote the first draft of this paper, well, I clarified natural right. I clarified historic right in terms of biblical thing. I brought in Spinoza and this and that. I built up the whole picture. And then I clarified freedom. What is freedom? What is justice? What is peace? As understood, mistake, slip of the tongue, as envisioned by the prophets. What? It dawned on me now, 40 years later, the document wasn't meant as a takeoff for a philosophy course where we're going to explain and clarify what freedom is not. Well, that's when I used to teach political philosophy. You spent the year, understanding the different readings and so on to understand what these concepts are. This is a proclamation for the beginning of a new state. Now, it didn't. I thought, well, I was in Oleh Chadash when I wrote this paper, And I said, well, I'm in a new country in Israel. What is it? What? And so I spent the time clarifying and arguing for what it was all about. When I finished, the committee that was looking at this paper, when I handed in the first 80 pages, they turned it down. Well, obviously. I thought they turned it down because of political. You know, a lot of politics going on in academia, and sometimes they turn it down because of politics. But here it wasn't a question of politics. It's a book on the Proclamation. What does Descartes got to do with it? Hegel, I talked about Hegel and Marx and the socialist mentality and freedom and de Tocqueville and this, and I took a philosophic thinker on each of these concepts and showed what the prophet added. What was added? Well, this is a book on the Proclamation for a layman. It's a proclamation. It's not meant to be a topic for analysis of everything in the document. So when we're going to try to teach it, that's what got me on this article, because they talked about teaching it. They're falling into the same trap that I fell into. Namely, they're going to explain the document. They meant to say, you know what freedom is, right? The prophets came first. That's what it was. Well, one of the types of thinkers in the ancient world that held the doctrine. You know what peace is, right? That's all. And they didn't, their concern was not to have it that understood like a philosophy person would say, look, I took a great course and I learned something about these concepts in terms of how they function and how they operate in the political, and here are the readings and blah, 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 blah. I mean, for me, a philosophy person, great. I learned a lot. But what does it have to do with the proclamation, with the document? So when I read this article, and they have a program at Bar Ilan that's a curriculum for the education, and teaching it in the high school, like we teach the Declaration of Independence in America. So here to teach the proclamation, they're going to fall into, even if they may even fall to the myth, they may even buy historic right, which is not a viable concept. But even if they do, the document, they're going to make the same mistake that I made. At a low level, they won't spend all the time on freedom. And I took a philosopher of freedom. I took John Stuart Mill on liberty, and from the West, I took philosophers to articulate the concepts, and then try to show that underneath the document and these meanings of the concept, there underlay a whole rich, deeper understanding of socio-political values than heretofore. So there was the point of, well, you know what that is, except that the prophet said it, but you know what that is. Okay, so in the process of clarifying all of that, so I took a philosopher each one. I took Kant on, who wrote on peace in the international situation. I took John Stuart Mill's book on liberty, still remains one of the great classics of democracy and the concept of what we call the liberty, concept of freedom. And I took Rawls, he came to Harvard when I was going out, and I bought his book and I read it. Great book, Justice is Fairness, and he deals with, it's become the classic book on the nature of justice. And so I took these things, I clarified them, and then I critiqued them. But again, to read a book on the Proclamation and have to spend 20 pages on this philosopher and 20 pages on this, I realized, looking back, of course, they said the guy's a nut. And what was the point? What was the point? It's so interesting how life works. It had a subtitle. It said, Proclamation of Independence of the State of Israel. The subtitle was Life, Mind, and Time. So when and that's what I handed in, because I have the typewritten copy. And I never realized, until looking back at it now, what they must have seen. Here's this crazy guy. He comes, Oleh Hadash. He's a new professor in Israel, right? They didn't come with a big list of publications. So the guy, in a sense, is saying, well, I'm not a nobody. You know, I can articulate these philosophers, and here's the result. Here's the result of this whole business. And then they see the subtitle, and they say, why are we paying this guy a stipend each month to write a book on the Proclamation? He's not interested in the Proclamation. He's interested in something else. He's interested in the nature of the cosmos, the big picture, in terms of what I call life mind at that time. Life mind and time. And 50 years later, the number one problem in the life system in science is to understand the nature of time and the nature of life, and how do we get a mathematics that's going to be able to handle the fantastic richness and complexity of the human life system. And so it was like, took the fellowship as an occasion to do something else. Because inside the document, wherever it was feasible, I brought in life, mind, and time. And so I'm sure they looked at this thing and they said, not only is the guy making us crazy by putting in all these philosophers we got to read, what's the result? He's interested in something else. So they terminated the contract. And justifiably so. It had no value. Okay, so to make the story short and come up with a nice substantive part of the discussion is that the document talked about historic right. We show this was not a viable concept. This is a form of right by convention. It depends who's making the convening, who's doing the agreement. If it's universal, that's why that's what it says. It's a universal agreement. But when agreement can be undone, things change significantly up to a certain critical mass point in society, and all of a sudden the same group that was advocating this has a watered down version and then eventually no version. And so what looks like something solid, yes, it's solid for the time, but it doesn't have the pull of something higher than the human being. The idea of something by nature was viewed as something above the human domain. For the religious, it had a God concept that produced that nature, and the nature was not, quote, fickle. The nature was not as changeable as human opinion is. Human opinion is changeable. Now that's also half true, because as we know, human opinion also does a lot of, has changeability, but on the other hand, it also has certain things that remain fundamental, like not killing somebody. You examine in the anthropology world, it deals with cultures that are primitive, so-called primitive cultures. In almost every culture that you look at, killing is not just a given. I mean, it's put in ritual, whatever it is, but it's not just taken for granted, that's the thing to do. You know, there's certain things that thou shalt not murder is somehow a universal something that pulls on the human mind. As something that can't be violated. It has to be put in bounds and so on. Okay, so here we had this embarrassing situation of having a document with these two concepts that were non-viable. I loved the paper. I mean, I finished it. I never published it. Now I'm going to publish it back, redone completely. As you'll see right away what's this all about. So the basic point was, okay, here we have a document. Here we have a document, and it has no ground. It's very embarrassing that that doesn't have any ground. Okay, so in the process of working this thing out, as I returned to the document, somebody suggested a couple years ago, why don't you pull it out of the mothballs and publish it? Now's the time to do it. Okay, but I learned a lot in 45 years. I mean, there's all the tapes ready to go in the garbage, you know. And I changed my whole approach to understanding everything. And so, what did I discover? I discovered that in the Moses world, the Moshe world, of the world of the biblical, they did not have a concept of history. Now that for us seems, you're crazy. I mean, everybody has a concept of history. In the West, the past, present, and future is a fundamental logical or conceptual structure in the human being. You read Piaget, how the child passes through early stages, where he's closer to what was called the primitive mind, and then moves up into, at age 10 and 11, so the child takes on a structuration of that kind. Okay. So I looked at this document, And I realized, well, they're going to make the same mistakes. So what's the mistake? Natural, historic right is not a viable concept. But the Proclamation talks about historical association. There's an association between the Jewish people and the land. And it mentions historic right once or twice, I think once or twice, but it mentions historic association about 12 times. Okay, so what is that all about? So the first point is I discovered that to take for granted that the only conception of time is linear, what I call past, present, and future, is not exact enough to be captured. For example, if one looks at the Moses society, the Moses world, and enters it like an anthropologist, then one sees certain things that are not us. They had no concept of logic. Not only that they didn't formulate the rules like Aristotle did. Plato had logic, but he didn't formulate the rules. Aristotle formulated the rules, but not in that sense. They did not have the concept of something that referred to something else. They did not have the concept of a proposition, what we call A is related to B, or all A are B, all B are C. They didn't have this way of thinking. And so they had instead association. And more particularly, you get till I'm blue in the face, you heard it a million times, I'm so big on the performative utterance. Why? Why? Because their primary language for discourse was not the assertion. Assertions are true or false. Indeed, when I dealt with the Proclamation, I took everything as an assertion. Freedom is this, freedom is that. And therefore it said, well, Joel Levinson come along and say, I don't like that, I'll criticize this, I don't like that, I'll criticize that, because I took it as a document of assertions. But if you read it more carefully, it's a proclamation. It's a declaration. A declaration is neither true nor false. It doesn't assert anything. It declares, like your belief package, your principle. You could make an inquiry into what that is, but the use, the language, the linguistic use is what's called performative utterance. You're using a language that does not enter the world of truth or falsity. When you have a ship, in order to finish the ship, you christen the ship and you say, this is the Queen Mary, and you smash a bottle of champagne. There's always an act, a physical act that accompanies the words, like in the marriage ceremony, and you give a ring and so on, you have the words. That's called establishing a chalos, establishing a status by language. And when the Chumash talks about medaber, that the human being is medaber, speak, to me, knowing what we know about animal languages and communication system and birds and so forth, yes, it's very hard to maintain a very sharp distinction between animal communication and human communication, in the sense that there's no line. There's animal talk, there's language, there's communication, like what we would call assertion. But no animal can make a legal status. No animal can make a chalos on something by saying, Hare zeh mekudeshet li, and now you're married. What happened? You're the same person you were yesterday. But you're not the same person. The words, the performative utterance has established a status on you which has consequences. The day before you could go out with a different girl. Today after you can't. Then if you do that, you're a Vera and blah, 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 whatever it is. The point is that this whole idea of association between the Jewish people and the land, that's in the document. How do I read it? I say, wait a minute. Every person has what I call a self-identity set of performatives. Namely, in conversation, all of a sudden you're talking to somebody about something and you say, yeah, but I'm Jewish. Now, you could take that as an assertion, true or false, or you can take that as a declaration in the context of the discussion. Sometimes we don't stick. We start off on explaining something and then we shift to giving advice, we shift back and forth in different uses of language. You take any 10 minutes of conversation, you'll find assertion, you'll find command, and you'll find performative, making statuses. Those are the three basic functions of language. We in the West are so preoccupied and dominated by assertion. Assertion is our paradigm, and it came from the Greeks. That's why Chazal fasted, because the Hebrew looks like on the surface, and the way we read the Chumash, we read it as Western. We read it in logical terms. At least I read it like that for years, and realized that I'm missing everything. And so when one enters the biblical world via an anthropology approach, one comes up with things like, well, there is no historical time. There's no past, present, and future. Then you learn about other language. There was Chiti. There were other languages that had no past, present, and future in the grammar. The grammar of the language did not have past, present, and future. So what emerged from this was a realization that there's no historic right, not only because it's by convention and doesn't have that unchangeability that we talked about that's a natural right, but because it presupposes history. I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about the past and the present and the future of the Jewish people. And that's how we look at it. And by the way, that's what for me was the secret of Kohelet. The secret was and still remains, and it has to be worked out and developed. The point being that if the human being can only view things in society, things about himself, in terms of linear time, he gets Havel, meaningless. Because it is the fact that everything dies. Everything comes to an end. Everything dies. And so one is born first, but one dies. And so if you deal in linear time, the future brings with it death. And of course, if you get too preoccupied, you can stop living. I mean, if you get too preoccupied, then you get into depression and so on. But the point is that there is no linear time. Okay. Further, we're going to talk about 2 minutes about naming. This is an old institution. Giving a name to a newborn state goes way back into antiquity. So it was covered in a ceremonial, and then later became part of kingship. And the whole procedure here is a declaration, like an identity statement. So I said, what is this thing all about, this performative? So I said every person has a self-identity bestowed statement he puts on himself. And it's exhibited in conversation where you see that. It's not studied text, studied material. It emerges automatically, where somebody feels the urge to say, yeah, but I'm Jewish. Meaning not that you can go check my file, but that I'm declaring something. And I want to stop, in effect, I'm stopping the conversation from continuing about analysis and centering on this self-bestowed identity performative. In the literature, all this emphasis that I put on the performative came from halakha, because the legal system, the great legal system, any great legal system, and Torah in particular, the halakha is dealing with legal statuses, their relationships, and consequences and conditions. That's the halachic system. That's what makes it so fantastic and so beautiful to work with. How the mind has to work to understand these different statuses. And a person can have two different statuses functioning in two different ways. And in one context, the status is doing one thing, in another context, it's doing something else. And so you have these relational linkages. And to clarify them out is a fantastic work. Of course, in the yeshiva, we're very, very far away. All these arguments about yeshiva and everything, if we're talking about great yeshivas of Europe even, okay, but what are we talking about? When you examine the educational level, the understanding package, we're dealing with ignoramuses. For the most part, there's nothing to be proud of, the yeshiva bocha. But learning Torah, learning in the yeshiva, learning the Talmud system is part of the tradition, is part of the thing that keeps us going. It's a great legal system. Okay, but this was the point. So I got it from the halacha. And then I realized that by reading all the material and the philosophy of Wittgenstein, Austin, this guy, that guy, and realizing that there's a whole different world here. And the basic language for Moshe time is the performative. I venture to say people didn't talk so much. I venture to say there wasn't that much talk when you're doing something. We talk. We can be building a brick or doing something. There's so much talk, assertion that's part of the process. It spills over into everything. The whole notion of the assertion. Okay, so what did I discover? So not only they don't have this historical time, and that's the secret of Kohelet, because if you think and led to believe that the only way to conceive things is by having time, that's the way you have to do. You have to differentiate. The child has to learn between the past and the present and the future so that he can live. Like we have to learn through intelligence how to open a door. I mean, after we learn, it becomes habit, second nature. We don't worry about opening the door. But in the beginning, you read Piaget. I put all the Piaget books together and so on. You see, Piaget dealt with all of these things, and the child grows. Interesting. He didn't use this language, but the child moves from early years where it's dominated by performative and command into assertion. It learns its logic. It learns the logic of how to think. So he writes, when he talks about his books, about the child development and so on, it starts by, in a sense, duplicating the world of the performative. And then it, quote, graduates. And what we call thinking is heavily assertion, and what becomes the exception to the rule is the performative. The basic doctrine is the assertion. So I suggested, if we had the visual material, if we had an actual culture to examine, my guess is even in the Bedouin society, in contemporary, aside from other things, I bet if you examine the amount of talk that goes on during the day, you would find it significantly much less than the usual talk that accompanies things that we do in the West. So there's this entry. So what's the whole point? To sum up, what's the point? The point is that if we look at the document and we enter it anthropologically, if we look at it anthropologically, we see that it has a dominance, a primacy on a performative language, in particular the identification of oneself. In the psychological literature, one of the dimensions of contemporary psychology and personality psychology is the working out of the performative, just this thing I'm talking about. 20, 40 years ago when I read Austin and Wittgenstein and everything, they didn't talk like that. But today, I happened to Google in on something else, and I saw a whole list of articles and materials about personality, how we get it, what is personal identity, what's our identity. So the point that for us is that with this, I am a Jew, I am an Israeli, goes a package of associations. In other words, when you say that, with it is going, if you watch the conversation, you're going to start, let's say you're saying, but I'm Jewish. Well, what's the next statement? All of a sudden you say something kosher, about kashrus. It's just spontaneous, automatic. It means you associate your identity statement done by a performative on yourself with associations, with a package of associations. Those associations should enter the analysis and study of the document. So the main point was not to make the mistake that I made and try to clarify the concepts, but to achieve relevance by starting with relevance. To achieve relevance of the document, otherwise it's mere history. Sure, it's good for scholars, but it's not doing anything. Well, it could do something if we approach the document and say, well, not historic right, but association, historic association. And when we expand those packages of association, we find the viability of the document being entered into by an anthropological approach. And so I mentioned many times the book that has done this was Pedersen, Johannes Pedersen, a Danish scholar, 1926, which is a long time ago, and it's an anthropological entry into the world of the Bible and into the world of the kings and so on and so on. It's 800 pages, it's 2 volumes, and it has been bypassed. In its time, it was the book in every Protestant seminary that studied the Bible text. When I was at Columbia, I used to go to Union Theological, which is across the street, sit there with a kippah. I'm all right, what did I know? Nothing. But I had a kippah, and they looked at me, and they came in, and they used to, they have Bibles, all this mocking of lords, Well, this was done, the first time I ever saw it was with a Bible. The guy showed me his book, and in the book with all these passages with orange and red, and these things that you could see through, And the guy come over, asked me this and asked me that. I said, look, I don't know anything. I'm an ignorant guy. I'm like, well, of course, they didn't know anything. So the story. So anyway, the point is here, if you read, you just take one little thing. This guy, so he wrote in 1926. It was the key in the Protestant world. It has been totally bypassed by all the contemporary research of biblical scholars. In the last number of years, I read 25, and I have them on in a Xerox copy. They bypass it. It's assuming that they think the way we think. They don't think the way we think, and he'll tell you here chapters that they don't think the way we think. They don't have this story. So I just wanted to say one thing about the name. He has a section here on the neshama, how it works, what's the whole psychological perspective that's involved, and he's trying to show you the distinctive features of the biblical world. So he's stressing performatives in my language. So when you have a name, for us, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never harm me. Not here. Not here. Central to the society is the non-referential use of a name. The name is the thing. That's why the word davar in Hebrew can be translated as word and thing. Now they are, for the West, they are as far apart as you can get. The word bakes no bread. You can't get a piece of bread from a word. So that the distinction is wide. And in philosophy of science, the problem is how can the word called mathematics, mathematical thinking, be the key to understand nature, which we didn't make? How could it be that one of the greatest things that the human being has discovered, his ability to make mathematical structures, is the key to understand the physical, the natural world that we didn't make? The biggest paradox in philosophy of science, which remains to today, nobody has given an adequate explanation of how that could be. The two are as far apart as you can get. The word is one thing, and the thing is something else. Two different things, and we use them interchangeably. And so, the orientation here in my language is this thing. So he says, the soul is not limited to what is directly seen. It reaches across the world insofar as it acts. The name is the very peculiarity and power of the soul. It is the greatness of soul rather than report. And he goes on and he develops the most important feature about a name. He's talking about the name of the child, the name of a person. We have a ceremony where we name and declare. To name is to make a declaration. To name is a performative. To name is to say, I name, and you give the name of the child. That's what it is. It's bestowing a status called the name. But the name is not amenable to sticks and stones will break my bones. But names will never harm me. The performative is such that it is intrinsic. It's the power, it's the dynamics that are in the person. So the line between the person and the power of the person in the name is very indeterminate, and so the two go together. So when Chazal say, picture yourself coming out of Mitzrayim, well, try to do that. I tried to do that. I didn't get anywhere. I couldn't. You know, I guess you had to go see Ten Commandments, but I couldn't do anything. What are you talking about? Well, if they're hinting at a different way of looking at things, well then, this is what they're saying. They're saying, oh yes, you don't have to read a paper of an eyewitness to get the feel of what happened at the time. Okay, that's what I did in the first part. But if you understand this approach, the name carries the power. The name, it's not just a word. It's not just, quote, by convention. Language for the Greeks went along with the assertion was by convention. You made up the words and you stuck to the words, and some words had one meaning, other words had the same words, equivocal and non-equivocal meanings, and this is the way it developed. And built into assertion has been all of this, and indeed the advances, I'm not minimizing by any stand. One of the reasons why there was very little mathematics, if any, in the biblical world is because it didn't have all this Greek picture to go with it. From assertion went natural languages, artificial languages, computer languages, languages that the human being can construct to do different types of work. So our whole science technology is built on the assertion and its great power. But when it comes to society, when it comes to the individual, there we're amiss, because it's words. The patriotism, it's words. We sing the national anthem. It's just words. It doesn't capture. It doesn't do anything. And so what they're talking about over here is from this anthropological approach. The most important feature about the name is, however, not its linguistic significance, but the association with which it is charged. And I'm putting it in my language, and when you make that self-identity bestowal of self-identity, with it goes an association package. And what he's talking about in that society, that's his words. In that society, that's the way they thought. The character of thinking was not in logic. The character of thinking was not subject-predicate. The character of thinking was what associates with what. When something associates with something else, that's thinking. That's persuasion. And I began to make a practice in the last year, 2 years, when I'm reworking the document. Oh yeah. Catch the immediate associations. Not in studied discourse, not in a philosophy classroom, not in preparing a lecture, in conversation. Study you yourself. Study what you say, what you associate, and gradually build up what is this association package that is your identity. When you say, I'm Jewish, you mean this. When another guy says, I'm Jewish, he means that. And when you put them together, we have the whole of Klal Yisrael with different dimensions, different emphases, all part of Klal Yisrael, but with different packages of associations. And so the association is the way they thought. They didn't think in logical categories. They thought in association. In other words, on the assumption that if it comes into the mind, it's there. Like when Freud talks about, slips of the tongue and so forth. When it comes in spontaneous, right? Here's a slip of the tongue. Well, that's telling you something. Every psychiatrist will tell you that he's very tuned in when the patient is on the couch to anything that's in this area of slip of the tongue, because that conveys the unconscious. And so Freud wrote a book and talked about jokes, and he did a lot of work on this whole area of topic, and this was the basic point. So I'm taking the thing, putting it in this identity statement, self-bestowed identity. I'm Jewish, I'm Israeli, I'm this, I'm that. And then catch the association package. And in the article for the letter, I said, well, instead of making the mistake that I made, enter that way. Enter with the anthropological approach. You built in the relevance to your life automatically. It's not a history lesson. It's not a discussion of political philosophy. It's how the document is functioning as part of you right now. And if those associations are meager and very flat, this is telling you something that, what's it got to do? I don't have anything to do with proclamation. What do I have to do with proclamation? I live today. I have a modicum of freedom, a modicum of peace, blah, blah, blah. In other words, it will tell you the value function, okay, the worth function of the document. Not historic right, but historic association cast in this way. And so the subtitle of the book, when I finished, it's just about ready to go, is this the dissolution of historic right, but the recovery, or whatever you want to call it, of the document by entering it with a performative use of language. And that performative use of language will automatically show us where it is, what it is. If it's saying nothing, it'll come out. It won't come up. And for most people, it says nothing. Well, what's the thing? It doesn't say anything. Because again, it's not a political science lesson. It's not a political philosophy. We know what freedom is, right? Well, you have to read to know what freedom is. Whatever you say it is, you give a few examples. That's what it is to you, right? I mean, you don't have to read de Tocqueville and this guy and that guy, and all the books as this academic subject. And the proclamation wasn't meant to be analyzed the way I did. It was meant to be taken as part of your contemporary relation to the state, to where you live. And what relates more is the barbecue, the music, the thing. Matter of fact, this year, somebody told me, I heard they read the proclamation, the actual document, which is, they never did that. But I think that the article in the paper there was that they're having a project of how to teach it. They're going to fall into the same trap that I did, and it's not going to be relevant. Who's going to give a damn about the proclamation? You're living in the now, right? You're living in the now. So here was this thing, and I just showed, and he puts it. You would never. We are unable to understand this manner of thinking unless we look upon it from the psychological standpoint of the Israelite. We must realize what is implied by the soul not being limited to the ego, the conscious, finished personality. The soul is in everything that fills it, in the renown, in the property, in everything wherein it works. Therefore the soul may live even though the ego disappears. The supreme desire of the Israelite is life. That is strength, power, strength as it acts in the bracha and blessing and is shaped by kavod. He desires that life is never to run out, but is to be constantly renewed. Therefore, he desires sons more than anything else on this earth. It is his desire to live which demands them, for the son bears his name, in him his life and soul live continually. Without this approach to the document, it will turn out to have very little functional value today. And as far as the Chumash world, I learned and realized, unless you enter this way, with this, what I call an anthropological, as if it were a culture that we're not familiar with, if you don't enter, you don't get the richness, you don't get the fullness of Chazal talking about Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. We're in Western, we're external, we're outside. We don't catch what it was to have your name be passed on, what it was not to have a son who didn't carry the name. So you have to fill in, and then of course it gives you a key to drash. It gives you an opening to say, well, where is the drashot in Agaritas and in Midrash? Where are those things? Where are those stories and stuff that are carrying snippets of this kind of an approach? If you're oblivious to the approach and you enter the text like we all did, at least I did, reading the text as assertions. God said this, God said that, God did this. So I said, who's God? Wait a minute. Are there proofs? And I spent half the time studying God proofs, and found out there are no proofs. And the only one I ever came to that said the same thing was my Rebbe. But the average rabbi won't, we're not facing up to the reality. So when it comes to the notion of a shame, and he talks here about the shame of Kodesh Baruch Hu and so on and so on, but the approach is catching things that are not, we don't think of it. To say we don't think, he has a heading, we don't think the way Israelites thought. They have a different way of thinking. Well, what do you mean? Thinking is thinking is thinking. What's the different way? What's the different way? There's levels, okay, but there's maturation. Read Piaget, and there's a maturation. Mayor was over here today. We had a fantastic conversation. One of it is I pointed out to him that in Piaget, a great child psychologist, his model for thinking was Einstein, relativity, not quantum. In other words, the notion of chance, chaos, indeterminacy, okay, the notions that were fundamental in the understanding of the quantum physics, okay, of particles, was not dominant in Einstein. Einstein has an ordered system, a system of high order. There's no chaos. There's no notion of chance. There's no notion of the indeterminate. Everything is clean and the mathematics is clean. Piaget, when I worked on Piaget for so many years, was that Piaget, the child begins in a world of the performative. I even said I wanted to do research for NASA on that topic. It never went through, but the basic idea was that if we pulled together a team that would study, a cognitive psychologist and physicist, that would study experientially, the child lived in a quantum world. The child lived in a world with no gravitation. So it could be checks on all the stuff we have to do to get simulation. This is the project, to get simulations of non-gravity situations and so on and so on and so on. In the study of the child, there's a stage where the child lives in a quantum universe with indeterminacy, and that's the dominant. In Piaget, he graduates out into logical thinking at age 10, 12, 13. But the model for Piaget that I discovered is Einstein thinking, which puts no stress on chance. God plays no dice with the universe, and so on, so on, so on, so on. And so, Mayor, we were talking about the indeterminate and the Hefker, and the Mikre, the Mikre. And that's a big point in the Kabbalah system and in the Torah system. So that it opens up by coming in with part of your armory, part of your material. That's how it functioned for me. I came in with part of it, which then allowed you to go deeper and ask, well, what, you're the only one? You're the only one who has that? Come on. Maybe Rabbi Akiva hit it this way. Maybe Reb Tarfon hit it this way. So it opens up for work in whatever field you are, especially in Torah. It opens up a dimension that I said, if you look for it, you'll find it. If you don't look for it, it just passes by. We just take it for granted that we understand the biblical world. So you have to come in and read, and I said, even as a recommendation, take Levi Strauss, who was the dean of anthropology in the 20th century, lived to 102, and before you study, or every day, read 5 pages in Levi Strauss Anthropology, not about the Chumash, about another culture, what he calls primitive thinking, in another culture. Read it, and then have your morning coffee, and then you go study the text. Because you have to think, you have to begin to think like an anthropologist entering the field, not like a historian. And you're trying to capture the roots, the underpinnings, the dynamics of the society, which is not ours. Like I say, sticks and stones will break my bones. In the ancient world, why was there idolatry? Why? What was the power? Well, it comes right out of here. If the name and the thing, the word and the thing are really the same entity, but with the emphasis on the power, on the dimension of the energy. Okay? Well, if you made an idol, and isn't it absurd? I mean, how could a guy believe in an idol? That the idol is a god? How can a guy believe that? When so much of antiquity was filled with that. Well, not from this approach. From this approach, it's not assertion. When I first read that kind of stuff, I say, well, who the guy's an idiot? Who would say, here's a thing, a stone and a piece of wood, that's a god? Well, from our point of view, truth point of view, that's nonsense. But not from the point of view of the approach that they're taking. The approach that they're taking is that the physical object and the word are functionally interconnected in an essential way. So then what's not so far? The power of the God was in the idol. We look at that and say, who the hell would be so stupid to accept idolatry? Well, it was around a long time, and it was the ancient world. And it took a lot of people, and for us, it's Moshe Rabbeinu who cut through the whole analysis. I developed that in the Willem story of what it's all about, that bracha is a real thing. It's not words. It's not just words. That's his point. It's not just the language. In my language, it's not the language of the performative. It's the performative with its association package that fills in the name. And so when we pass on the name, then you could begin to realize what it is, why it's so important to have a son in the Chumash. Because the son, the way it did, carried the name. In a matriarchal society, I studied some matriarchal societies in the ancient world, and then it's a different story because the name goes according to the mother. But most of the time, it was the masculine that went through. So I'm going to give an example by the way he writes, the way he talks. Is as name and renown belong together, so do life and memory. He who lives acts upon other souls. As long as he acts, he is not dead. We know the close connection which in the eyes of the Israelite exists between soul and all the sensations and ideas involved. Again, to come back to the point and sum up, what I discovered was that the conceptual intellectual approach to study the document, which can be generalized to other documents, to other things in the past, to study the Federalist Papers, to study other things, one is shortchanging the richness by coming in with a dominance of the assertion approach to language. That if you mix together with assertion, the performative, and I say, make exercise, take the Chumash and wherever it is possible, read things as a performative, and you get a different picture. And the last one that I did was the thing we talked about a month ago, Bereshit, right? It says God says. It doesn't mean said. I took it as said. Fact. Did he say it or didn't he say it? Well, then I said, Rambam. I went straight to the Bar Nevuchim. When I came to the Rebbe, and I said, look, I studied the Rambam. Yeah, but he said, you didn't know anything about Torah. You studied the Rambam. Well, of course. If you're immersed in assertion, then the whole predominance is truth or falsity. Well, you pay a price. You pay a price because you belittle everything else. And if you fall into the trap of belittling a person because they don't know enough, then your whole life becomes a different order. When I used to say philosophize with a sword, wow, yeah, that was 50 years ago. Namely, by study and by constantly understanding and preparing lectures 20 hours a week and so on, and knowing what the student's going to say before they open their mouth. As soon as the student opens their mouth, you know what they're going to say. you didn't listen. And you missed those gems that come out of a student that are spontaneous and on the spot, and you didn't study that. You missed it. You're not omniscient. So you did a lot. You can convey, you can predict the argument in class. But sometimes the student opens his mouth and says something, and if you're on it and say, you have to say like I said, I'll see you tomorrow. I'll see you next week. Go home. Enjoy the coffee. And have a coffee break. Because you realize you're not listening. You're not hearing. So it affects your whole orientation. I would never say that. I would never say that you philosophize with a sword. Meaning, you philosophize with an argument where you put the other by to rest and say, you can't argue anymore. So I say, when we open up the human being to a wider perspective, the human being, you get surprised. You talk to somebody on the telephone in a conversation about Torah, and all of a sudden you get some point that came out of the blue from the conversation. You never even thought about it. All of that dimension is eclipsed and pushed, in such a way that you lose the power of the rest of the text. Like, you can't expect everybody to be concerned with your concerns. You have to give the range for other people. People have the neshama is so rich in each individual person that it captures different packages. And that's part of the clown. That's part of the people. It's part of you. So why do you shrink and run, in a sense of run away? And I pondered many times early, is it not a running away from life? Wasn't this Joe Levinson at age 17? That was linked together with your personality, with your whole orientation. Like I mentioned in passing before, Oleh Hadash didn't do anything in the field, comes to Israel, shows a committee that, well, this guy's not a dope. He can write about John Stuart Mill and Descartes and Marx and this and that, and say, well, let's do something. Give him his proper advance. Because when I came here, the giving the ranks was stopped. We came in 71. In 68, 69, 70, people who came in academia got decent positions with ranks. By the time I came around, they gave you the bottom. They said, in effect, you have to start over. So you became a martzeh. That was an instructor. Anyway, the point of tonight was to show, one, that this concept of historic right is in no way a viable concept. Number two, it presupposes, in addition to having the changeability dimension, which is not the key here, they were concerned with permanence, not change. We're concerned with change, because that's the real life. So here was this view, and the historic right gets substituted by historic association, and then I packaged it in terms of a performative and the association package that goes with it. And if we're going to teach the document or try to understand the document, we should at least enter with the performative use of language and not the assertive use of language, and get bogged down in truth or falsity questions. And so this was the basic point, and to show you the orientation. This book, this Pedersen book, is the only book. It's called Israel, Its Life and Culture. 4 volumes, but it's in two books. It's 800 pages. He was a philologist, and he caught the key. He caught the key to understand through coming in through linguists and coming in through language. So he could say, they don't think the way we think. They have a different concept of thinking. That's Israeli association. Because in that association package includes meeting this guy, meeting that guy, this guy. So that what you have, as he says here, you must enter with a psychological focus. I add the anthropological so that you don't get wrapped, in a assertion framework. You introduce something that has the relevance built in. And then we see how we can teach the document. Maybe they'll publish it for this time, I don't know. Anyway, this was the basic point, and unfortunately, as I said, I found so much of it. I read it at least 15 times over the years, maybe more. And every time I'm stuck on something, when you couple together with, the Egyptian base of the Hebrew and this, it's a 1-2 punch that unfortunately none of the people in the world, in the Torah world, are building on. They're not seeing it. And yet, for me, it meant so much to see it and open up a whole different understanding.